everyone, and welcome to week 4 of conflict analysis and transformation. So we've talked about the conflict transformation part. This week, we'll start looking into some of the key tools to help you in starting to do a conflict analysis. If transformation is the goal, we need to have some tools of analyzing, looking at the different aspects of a conflict in order to determine a path towards that goal. As you're aware, your final papers for this course will involve doing an analysis of a current ongoing conflict. These tools should help you in doing your analysis so that you're looking in the right direction, you're asking the right questions. And the aim is to understand many aspects and angles of a conflict so that the recommendations on how to move toward a more peaceful future are grounded in reality. Let us get into this. This week, in addition to this video, you'll be completing the micro course on peace from the United States Institute for Peace, USIP. This course should take about 45 minutes roughly to complete. And at the end, you will have a quiz, after which you'll be given a certificate. And you need to upload that certificate as part of your assignment for this week. There are many other free courses in USIP, which are highly recommended. They're very good. USIP has been one of the most prominent institutions for conflict analysis and peace studies. If you complete an additional course, and you can email me the certificate of completion to get 3 extra points towards your final grade. So first, a few dimensions of conflict. When you're looking at a particular conflict, you need to be mindful of the possible dimensions of that conflict. Is it an interstate conflict, or is it an intrastate conflict? Of course, interstate means between one or more sovereign nation. Intrastate usually involves a central government and various guerrilla or paramilitary groups, militias, that are fighting against the ruling powers. More and more in the 21st century, conflicts have been intrastate, and there are fewer interstate conflicts, barring, of course, there's some current ones ongoing right now between Russia and Ukraine, and ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, and potentially others. A conflict can also involve professional armies. Those are the militaries that are trained, equipped, supported by the government. It can also involve militias, which operate outside of the official sanctioning of the government. In very complex conflicts, there can be many different militias who are operating at the same time, and they may each have their own interests, their own leadership, their own structures, and sometimes those interests overlap with each other, and sometimes they don't. And you can also see militias fighting against each other, as well as against the central governing groups. And these militias will often get their military support, either through buying and selling arms through the black market, or pretty often they get support from foreign countries. And those countries have an interest in the success of those groups which are fighting against the central government, or they're acting as spoilers. This is an important term for you to know and remember. A spoiler is anyone who has an interest in seeing the conflict continue, and spoilers often have the ability to derail an attempt towards peace. Next, we'll talk about this more in our video next week when we discuss getting to yes, but there will be various types of interests of the parties to the conflict. There are territorial interests, which can include access to resources, natural resources, water, minerals, oil, etc. There also can be interests related to race, ethnicity, religion. It's not always black and white in terms of these interests. Many times they overlap and intersect. For example, a territorial interest can be connected to a religious interest. For example, if a particular location is spiritually significant to a particular religious group. In looking at the dimensions of a conflict, there are military casualties versus civilian casualties. There's the Geneva Convention, which outlines humane treatment during times of war and conflict, including to limit fighting to military targets and to minimize civilian casualties. These are not always adhered to and can even be blatantly ignored, not only by militias, but also by the governments themselves. And you can also consider the level of sophistication of the weapons that are being used. There are, very sophisticated, highly advanced weapons, or very simple but lethal weapons. Are biological weapons being used? Is there a threat of nuclear weapons, either owning or using or developing? Simple weapons can be simple, but they are no less destructive. Suicide bombers is the case in point. So I spoke about this briefly in a previous video, I believe, but just to reiterate, we must consider in our analysis the difference between negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace means the absence of war, the absence of violent conflict, or even after a war is over, when a treaty is signed, an agreement is signed, there can be a state of negative peace. The conflict is technically over, but there is a state where each party is still kind of waiting and seeing, is this agreement really going to hold? Is the other side really going to keep their word? And in this negative peace, tensions can easily break out again. Pictured here is actually a very recent peace agreement between Rwanda and the DRC. So a long ongoing conflict that's debilitated the region. Another example of negative peace is the Second Sudanese War, which was from 1983 to 2005, about 22 years. Maybe 20, the estimates are about 2 million people were killed, including many civilians. And this was preceded by the First Sudanese War, Civil War, which ended just 10 years prior. And that one lasted 17 years. So even now, there's yet a third Sudanese Civil War, which broke out in 2003, and that's still ongoing. And so these periods between each of these wars, you could see as like a negative peace. Maybe war is technically over, and there were some hard-won peace deals. For example, at the end of the Second Sudanese War, South Sudan became its own country. But somehow, what is needed to move on and build a more peaceful future was not developed enough in those interludes. There was just a state of negative peace, and tensions erupted again. So positive peace means that both the external violence and the injustices in society, which led to the violence in the first place, are being addressed. This is what Lederach is talking about with conflict transformation, how to build that positive peace. The causes that lead to violence are addressed. That's economic causes, religious causes, racial causes, ethnic tension causes, and causes related to inequality. So all those things need to be addressed in order to have a positive peace. An extremely useful tool, which USIP also completely embraces, is Lund's curve of conflict. This comes from the book from Michael Lund, Preventing Violent Conflicts. You can check it out, it's on Amazon. But his curve tracks conflicts in terms of time, that is on the horizontal axis, and also in terms of intensity along this vertical axis. Not everything can be neatly placed in any one category. And sometimes a conflict can move very quickly between different stages, but it's just a very helpful tool to start to understand a particular conflict and put it into context. So let's look at each one of these categories. First is a durable peace. This is from Lund's book, and I'll just read it for you here. A durable peace involves a high level of reciprocity and cooperation and the virtual absence of self-defense measures among parties, although it may include their military alliance against a common threat. A positive peace prevails based on shared values, goals, and institutions, for example, democratic political systems and rule of law, economic interdependence, and a sense of international community. An example of this would be the US and Canada relations. Even if the US and Canada may disagree from time to time, especially if there are different viewpoints between the different administrations, between the prime minister and the president. But we enjoy a high level of closeness. There's a high level of trust and mutual support and integration of our economies. There's not a need to hide things from each other. Another example would be the relationship of the countries in the European Union. Next stage is what Lund calls stable peace. This is a relationship of wary communication and limited cooperation, for example, trade, within and an overall context of basic order or national stability. Value or goal differences exist, and no military cooperation is established. But disputes are generally worked out in nonviolent, more or less predictable ways. And the prospect for war is very low in a stable peace. An example would be US and China relations. There is a tension there. We don't see completely eye to eye on many things, but the differences are still worked out through normal means, through diplomacy, through our embassies, and through those avenues. And there is a mutually beneficial trade. This kind of relation could become an unstable peace. In a stable peace, you know where the line is that you do not cross, lest you move towards an unstable peace or even crisis. For example, within the relationship between the US and China, a clear line is Taiwan. We do not, in the US, the US government would not put pressure on China about Taiwan. Because we know that is a line we do not cross. That would create instant tension, and we would very easily move into an unstable peace. Or if the US government was to push China or spoke up against China on human rights issues, then there would be instant tensions. Next is unstable peace. This is a situation in which tension and suspicion among parties runs high, but violence is either absent or only sporadic. A negative peace prevails because although armed force is not employed, the parties perceive one another as enemies and maintain deterrent capabilities. A balance of power may discourage aggression, but crisis and war are still possible. In a stable peace, as we said, you know what not to talk about, because if you do, it would create tension, and you avoid the tension because the benefit of the relationship outweighs what you'd gain by creating that tension, right? With the US and China, we don't go certain places with China because the benefit of the relationship outweighs anything we would gain by bringing up those issues. But in an unstable peace, by contrast, that point of tension is always on the table. You cannot relate to each other without that point of contention, that tension. An example is US North Korea. The issue that is always on the table for the US is denuclearization, right? The US does not want a nuclearized North Korea. And if there's any relationship communication, that's always on the table. But North Korea has no interest in denuclearizing because there is an imbalance of power that is not in their favor. There's no outright skirmishes or military attacks between the US and North Korea, though you can argue that at some points in our relations, things easily moved into a crisis category, but there is an uneasy quote unquote peace. The next stage is crisis. This is a tense confrontation between armed forces that are mobilized and ready to fight and may be engaged in threats and occasional low-level skirmishes, but have not exerted any significant amount of force. The probability of the outbreak of war is high. An example of a conflict in this crisis stage could be between India and Pakistan in the territorial disputes of Jammu and Kashmir. This has been an ongoing and deeply entrenched conflict, which has existed since the partition of India and Pakistan at the end of a British imperial rule. The conflict has definitely quite easily moved into the war stage and then back towards the crisis stage. Both India and Pakistan are definitely on high alert and ready to engage in threats or fight for their interests. India and Pakistan are not officially at war with each other, but tensions are definitely high and they engage in numerous clashes between their forces, especially in this territory, Jammu and Kashmir. For example, just last year in May 2025, India launched missile strikes on Pakistan, saying that it was in response to an attack in the Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir. The final stage in the curve of conflict is war. This is from Lund. War is sustained fighting between organized armed forces. It may vary from low intensity but continuing conflict or civil anarchy to an all-out hot war. Once significant use of violence or armed forces occurs, conflicts are very susceptible to entering a spiral of escalating violence. Each side feels increasingly justified to use violence because the other side is. So the threshold to armed conflict of war is especially important. So, depending on what stage or what the duration of the conflict, you're engaging in different types of diplomacy. So let's just look at each one of these very briefly. In a stable and also in a durable peace, you're engaging in peacetime diplomacy. You're working through your embassies and your ambassadors. There are established customs for international relations and diplomacy between nations and how we relate to each other. Those are adhered to and followed in a stable peace or in a durable peace. Once things start to move towards an unstable peace, you're engaging in preventative diplomacy. This is things like moving your troops towards the border. You're making a statement on your stance, or something will not be tolerated. This is also can include embargoes or bringing the infractions of a particular country to the attention of the UN in order to bring international pressure. You can still relate to each other through your embassies, but you become very careful about your language in order to prevent things escalating into a crisis. If things reach a crisis stage, you're engaging in crisis diplomacy. This is engaging in negotiations, such as those between those countries that are connected to the conflict directly or indirectly. An example of this is the six-party talks, where you have the direct parties, North Korea and South Korea, and also the indirect parties, the US, Japan, China, and Russia. In a crisis stage, it becomes very necessary to send an envoy or to have a mediator, some neutral party, to try to prevent things from blowing up into outright war. It starts in the crisis stage. It becomes very difficult to relate to each other directly. So you kind of need that buffer of a mediator, of an envoy, or something like the six-party talks to help manage the crisis. Then if things do escalate into an all-out war, you enter into peacemaking or conflict management. This can include third parties intervening, such as the United Nations. You're basically managing the conflict again, trying to see what can be done in order to end the war. Where are the openings? Where is the possibility to convince one side or the other that it is in their interest to work towards peace? Once things start to open up more and moving towards ending the war, you enter into peace enforcement. It becomes necessary to build confidence between the parties, right? During a war, a lot of trust is eroded. There's not a lot of belief or confidence that one side or the other is going to adhere to a peace agreement if a peace agreement is made. So you're trying to just decrease the tensions so that eventually an agreement can be made. You engage in things like confidence building measures, such as a ceasefire. You know, if a ceasefire is called for one day and both sides agree to it and they adhere to it and they respect it, that builds confidence. It says to each of them that, oh, the other side is going to, if they can agree to this one ceasefire and stick to it for one day, then maybe it is possible that they would agree to a peace treaty or agree to some kind of compromise or concessions, and that they're coming to the table for negotiations is not a trick or a ploy. And as the tensions decrease more and more and the frequency of violence becomes less and less, you enter into peacekeeping stage. You're just preventing the conflict from re-escalating. And again, this is confidence building measures, building trust, and each side having to adhere to and follow through with their agreements. And as a settlement is reached, and each party, each side is sticking to that agreement, and trust is starting to be built, more and more, then the parties can begin a process of conflict resolution or post-conflict peace building. This is things that are necessary to heal the country, such as truth and reconciliation efforts, such as in South Africa and many other places after conflict is over. There's a lot of things that need to be rebuilt. And then eventually things can move towards a stable peace and then hopefully a durable peace. So when you come to selecting the conflict that you will like to analyze for your final project, you will be asked to place your conflict along Lund's curve. Where is it in the curve right now? And why do you say that? And what are the indicators to prove this classification? Has the conflict recently moved? Has it moved from an unstable peace to a crisis, or from a war to a crisis? Is it in a situation where things could easily re-escalate? And if the crisis is over, maybe it's an unstable peace and things could erupt again. So as you see where that crisis falls on the curve, you can look at what types of interventions would be most appropriate or useful, depending on where it is. So finally, let's take a look at the analytical framework. This is developed in Democracy and Deep-Rooted Conflict, Options for Negotiators, which is from the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. This document is free to read. You just have to do a Google search and you can find it online. It is a long document, but it does have several interesting case studies, which you might find interesting. Where the curve of conflict helps us to analyze the evolution of a conflict, the analytical framework helps us to get some insights for the various forces driving a conflict at a particular point in time. We can use the framework to help us determine where the influence of a negotiator or a mediator or other interested parties who would like to support a peace process can be most effective. So these are just questions that I hope will guide you and are very useful in doing your analysis. So let's just go through each of these. First, you have to look at the actors in the conflict. Who are the primary actors? Who are the secondary actors? And who has influence over the events? Often it's not just those who are doing the actual fighting. There are foreign powers who are involved. There are spoilers that we talked about who have an interest in continuing the conflict. There are those international actors, foreign governments that have an interest in promoting peace and may be helpful. We have to look at all of those. Is the UN an actor in this conflict? So actors in the conflict can include government, international organizations, financial institutions, identity groups, factions within those groups, single issue groups, external actors, potential peacemakers, and also potential spoilers, which we've mentioned. And when you're looking at these actors, you can consider the top leadership, the middle leadership, or the grassroots leadership. We look at the root causes of the conflict, what is driving the conflict, and what are the needs and fears of each group. This is like when Lederach is talking about the patterns and the history. Many times there's the surface level causes, and then there's the deeper causes, which is tied to history and cultural identity, religious identity, and many interconnected causes. The issue, scope, and stage of the conflict. What are the key issues for each side? What phase is the conflict in? You placing it on Lund's curve, and who is suffering the most? You have to look at civilians, whether primarily military targets are involved, or is it more widespread? Are there marginalized groups, which are the primary targets and suffering from this conflict? How widespread is it across the country, the countryside, the city? Yeah, you have to look at all those different factors. The power, the resources, and the relationships. What are the resources and capacities of each side? What is the state of the relationship among the leaders? What are the existing channels of communication? Many times in a conflict, conflicts don't exist just in their own little bubble. There are outside actors which are positively and negatively impacting what's going on within that country and within that conflict. Many times different groups can get monetary, military support from a foreign government, which either helps or hurts. So you have to look at that. The relationship among the leaders. If you're dealing with leaders with their particular agendas or their egos, how is that impacting the conflict and how things are going and the trajectory and the future, hope for peace? What are some of the existing channels of communication? How are they utilized? Are there open channels to communication, or is it just completely no communication at all? Has there been a breakdown of communication in the past? Maybe a situation where a channel of communication was opened and it seemed things were going good, but it got derailed. For what reason? Why did that happen? And that's very important because then it impacts how people feel about the possibility for peace in the future. The history of the relationship. Did the parties ever coexist peacefully? What were the previous attempts at a settlement and why did they fail? Was there a pattern to the failures? This is important too, because if if an attempt to build peace was derailed or completely ineffective, then it makes it all the more difficult to build a new capacity for peace, or a new belief that peace is possible, or parties coexisting peacefully at one time or another. Why did it break down before? And what led people to be in the state they are now? So as you're reading and studying about the conflict that you choose, I hope you can take these questions, print them out, put them somewhere, reference them again, and answer them. And hopefully new questions will arise. Yeah, so refer back to them as you're doing your research, as you're learning about your selected conflict for your final. And I think with that, you will do a very good job, and you'll be able to really see the different aspects and really uh, find where are the real possibilities for building peace. So with that, I conclude, and I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.